The morning doesn't start with bad news. No accident, no emergency, no dramatic email from your boss. It starts the way most mornings start: an alarm, a hand reaching out, a half-open eye. And then before your feet even hit the floor, you grab your phone, not to check the weather, not to see what happened overnight, not even to scroll. You open your bank app, not because you're about to buy something, not because you're planning a big purchase. You're just confirming the ground is still there, like you're checking a smoke detector. Because if the number looks wrong, the whole day feels wrong. And if the number looks fine, you don't feel rich. You feel temporarily allowed to breathe. That's the part nobody says out loud. Most people aren't looking for money, they're looking for permission to relax for 12 hours. Then you leave the house. Normal commute, normal traffic, normal life. And later you're in a grocery store standing in front of cereal. Same aisle you've stood in 100 times. You look at the name brand, then the generic, then the price tag. Then without realizing it, you do the math in your head. Not because you love saving 80 cents, because you're not totally sure whether choosing the wrong box turns into a problem on Friday. And that's what's weird about it. Nothing big is happening. No major decision, no crisis. But every small choice feels like it has weight. Like your life is balanced on little numbers that shouldn't matter this much. From the outside, your life looks fine. But from the inside, it feels like you're living right at the edge of something you can't afford to let happen. And the scary part isn't today. It's the quiet thought that follows you through the whole day. If something goes wrong, if anything goes wrong, you don't have room for it. If your life looks fine on paper, why does it still feel so fragile? Why do so many people with decent incomes live in a constant defensive mode, like they're bracing for impact even on good days? Why does one small problem, a car repair, a medical bill, a delayed paycheck, have the power to knock everything off balance at once? And here's the part that doesn't seem to make sense at first. Why is it that there's one specific money milestone, not huge, not flashy, that completely changes how people make decisions? Not $1 million, not financial freedom, not early retirement, just $10,000. That number doesn't show up on magazine covers. It doesn't buy status. It doesn't make you impressive at dinner parties. And yet people who cross that line start moving through life differently. They pause instead of panic. They think instead of react. What's strange is that $10,000 doesn't make you rich, but it does something far more disruptive. It quietly rewires how you see risk, how you feel about uncertainty, how close danger feels on a normal Tuesday afternoon. And once that shift happens, you can't unfeel it. You can't go back to seeing money the same way again, which raises a more uncomfortable question. If this number is so small, why does life feel so different without it? Here's the part most people miss. The problem for most people isn't that they don't earn enough. It's that nothing ever stays. Money comes in, money goes out, and almost none of it is allowed to stop moving. When every dollar has an assignment before it even arrives, you never get ahead. You just rotate faster. That's what creates the constant pressure. Not poverty, not failure, a lack of distance. When you don't have money sitting still, money that isn't already spoken for, you're forced to make decisions in emergency mode, even when there is no emergency. Every choice gets filtered through the same question: can I survive the next thing? And that's why $10,000 matters, not because it's spending money, not because it upgrades your lifestyle, but because it creates space. $10,000 isn't about buying things. It's about buying distance from panic, from urgency, from being cornered by timing. It's the difference between reacting and choosing, between scrambling and planning, between saying yes because you have to and saying no because you can. That distance right there is the axis this entire conversation turns on. Because once you understand that, everything else that feels confusing about money starts to line up in a very uncomfortable way. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I'm not saying this as a guru. I'm not saying this as someone who cracked a secret code. And I'm definitely not saying this as someone who thinks people struggle with money because they're careless or undisciplined. I'm saying it as someone who's watched the same pattern repeat for years. I've seen people earning six figures who are constantly on edge, always tense, always reacting, one unexpected expense away from spiraling. And I've seen people earning far less who sleep just fine, who make decisions calmly, who don't panic when something breaks. That contrast is what caught my attention, because income alone doesn't explain it. Education doesn't explain it. Intelligence definitely doesn't explain it. What surprised me wasn't that high earners could get stuck. That part makes sense. What surprised me was how many of them had no idea where they were stuck. They thought the problem was effort, or timing, or not making enough yet. But when you zoom out far enough, the pattern looks different, and once you see it clearly, it becomes very hard to unsee. That's where this starts getting uncomfortable, because the thing that's holding people in place isn't invisible. It's just been normalized so thoroughly that almost nobody questions it anymore. And once you notice how that normalization works, you start to see the system behind it. Here's the structure most people are living inside whether they realize it or not. Money comes in, immediately it gets assigned. Rent or mortgage, utilities, insurance, phone bill, car payment, subscriptions you barely remember signing up for. By the time the paycheck finishes landing, it's already gone. What's left isn't savings, it's whatever didn't get claimed fast enough. And that's not an accident. Modern money systems are built around flow, not accumulation. They work best when your money keeps moving, when it never sits still long enough to become leverage. Subscriptions are the cleanest example. Small amounts, automatic, easy to ignore. Individually, they don't hurt. Together, they guarantee your baseline expenses keep rising. Installment plans do the same thing in a different way. They lower the pain of buying today while quietly raising the pressure of tomorrow. Buy now, pay later doesn't just split a payment, it splits your attention. You get the thing now and the consequences fade into the background until they don't. What all of these systems have in common is simple. They don't require you to fail. They don't need you broke. They just need you constantly committed. As long as your money is already promised, you stay responsive. You stay careful. You stay reactive. And when there is nothing sitting still, nothing unassigned, nothing waiting, you never gain distance. That's the quiet shift most people miss. When no money is standing still, every decision becomes a survival decision. Not because you're in danger today, but because you're never far enough away from danger to think clearly. And that's the moment where this stops being about budgeting and starts being about behavior. Once you see the system, the next question is obvious. Why does it work so well on people who are smart, capable, and trying? And the answer is uncomfortable but relieving. Your brain isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it's designed to do. When money feels tight, your brain switches into scarcity mode, not emotionally, biologically. In scarcity, the future shrinks. Your attention narrows. Long-term thinking gets pushed out by whatever feels urgent right now. That's why people with no buffer don't make bad decisions. They make short decisions, and those decisions pile up. On top of that, there's decision fatigue. Every day you're making dozens of tiny money calls. What to buy, what to skip, what can wait, what can't. Each one burns mental energy. By the end of the day, your brain is exhausted, not from work, from constant calculation. And when that exhaustion combines with elevated stress hormones, especially cortisol, your tolerance for uncertainty drops fast. You don't become reckless. You become conservative in the worst way. You avoid change. You delay action. You stick with what feels safe even when it's quietly costing you. That's why this isn't about discipline or motivation. It's about environment. Living without a buffer forces your nervous system into a permanent low-grade emergency. And in that state, the brain will always choose relief over progress. That's not weakness, that's survival. But survival has a price. and it doesn't show up all at once. At first, the cost feels small. You're tired more often, not physically, mentally, always thinking ahead, always bracing. Then it starts to shape your behavior. You put off decisions that could help you long-term because they feel risky. You stay in jobs you've outgrown. You skip opportunities that require upfront effort or uncertainty. Not because you don't want more, because you can't afford a misstep. Nothing explodes, nothing collapses. Life just tightens. Months pass, then years, and suddenly the pattern locks in. You're not failing dramatically, you're just not moving. Opportunities don't disappear, you stop being able to reach for them. The worst part is how invisible this becomes. From the outside, everything looks stable. Bills are paid. Life continues. But internally, you're always managing pressure, always calculating, always responding instead of choosing. That's how people get stuck for a decade without realizing it. Not through one bad decision, through thousands of reasonable ones made under constraint. There's no single moment you can point to and say, that's when it went wrong. It's erosion, not impact. And once enough time passes, the cost shows up in a quieter way. Confidence drops, options narrow, risk feels heavier than it used to. Not because you changed, but because the environment never gave you room to. And that's the part most people miss. The danger of not having a buffer isn't crisis, it's compression. Life slowly closing in until even good choices start to feel out of reach. This is usually the point where people push back. $10,000 sounds huge, not in theory, in feeling. Because when you don't have it, your brain treats it like a mountain. So let's shrink it back down to real life. Most car repairs don't cost $10,000. They cost a few hundred, sometimes a couple thousand if it's bad. Most medical surprises don't cost $10,000 either. Urgent care, ER visits, prescriptions, annoying, stressful, but rarely catastrophic. Even job loss, the scenario everyone fears most, doesn't usually require a miracle. It requires time. $10,000 doesn't replace your income. It buys you months. Months where you're not forced to say yes to the first thing that shows up. That's the part people miss. $10,000 isn't meant to be spent all at once. It's meant to exist. It's a shock absorber, a pause button, a buffer between life and your nervous system. And when you look at it that way, the number stops feeling dramatic. $10,000 isn't big. It just feels big when you've never stood on the other side of it. What actually matters isn't the size of the number. It's what that number quietly removes from your life. Urgency. And once urgency disappears, something else changes too. Because now there are two very different ways life can play out from the exact same starting point. Picture two people living in the same city, same rent range, same grocery store, same paycheck. From the outside, they look identical. Person A has no buffer. Every dollar is already spoken for. When something breaks, they react. When a decision comes up, they rush it. Waiting isn't an option because waiting costs money they don't have. Person B has $10,000 sitting quietly in the background. They don't spend it. They don't show it off. Most days they forget it's even there. But when life throws the same problem at both people, the response is different. Person A is forced to decide now. Person B gets to decide later. That difference sounds small. It isn't. Person A takes the first job offer. Person B can wait for a better one. Person A avoids risk entirely. Person B can take a calculated one. Person A optimizes for survival. Person B optimizes for trajectory. Neither person is smarter. Neither one works harder. They're just operating under different clocks. One is racing deadlines. The other has room. And that room doesn't guarantee success. But it changes the game being played. Because once you're no longer forced to choose under pressure, you start to notice something unsettling. A lot of the smart decisions you thought you were making were never really choices at all. There's a name for the pattern that shows up once you notice it, and it's not flattering. It's reaction-based living. That's when your life isn't shaped by intention. It's shaped by whatever shows up next. An email comes in, you react. A bill hits, you adjust. Something breaks, you scramble. You're not choosing direction, you're managing pressure. From the inside, it feels responsible. You're staying on top of things. You're handling problems as they appear. But zoom out and the pattern looks different. You're not moving toward anything. You're just preventing things from going wrong. That's why days feel busy but unproductive. Weeks pass without momentum. Years pass without a clear shift. And the hardest part is this. Reaction-based living doesn't feel like failure. It feels like adulthood. You tell yourself this is just how life works, that everyone is juggling, that everyone is tired. But that story only makes sense when you've never experienced the alternative. Because once you have even a small buffer, the trap becomes obvious. You realize you weren't living cautiously by choice. You were living cautiously because you had no margin. And that realization is uncomfortable, not because it's dramatic, but because it reframes so many smart decisions as forced ones. Which raises a question most people never stop to ask. If reacting is your default state, who benefits from keeping it that way? Here's where things get clearer. The system you're living in doesn't need you to be reckless. It doesn't need you to fail. It doesn't even need you to be unhappy. It just needs you to be slightly anxious. Financial institutions make money when cash keeps moving. Credit works best when emergencies require borrowing. Subscriptions thrive when attention is fragmented and decisions are automated. None of this requires a villain. It requires normal behavior repeated. When you don't have a buffer, you pay for speed, fast fixes, convenience fees, interest. When you're under pressure, you accept terms you wouldn't otherwise accept. You renew things you don't use. You avoid friction even when friction would save you money. And over time, that becomes the baseline. The system doesn't ask whether this is good for you. It just responds to incentives. A calm customer with options is hard to monetize. A stressed customer with deadlines is easy. So the structure gets normalized. Living close to the edge becomes normal. Always being busy becomes a badge of honor. No one tells you to build space, because space makes you slower to manipulate. That's not a conspiracy, it's just how incentives line up. And once you see that alignment, one thing becomes clear. The absence of a buffer isn't accidental, it's profitable. Which brings us back to the number that started this entire conversation. $10,000 doesn't buy freedom, it doesn't let you quit your job, it doesn't turn you into a different person overnight. What it buys is distance. Distance from panic, distance from urgency, distance from being forced to decide right now. And that distance changes everything that follows. With space, your nervous system settles. With a settled nervous system, your decisions improve. With better decisions, your trajectory shifts. Not dramatically, quietly. You stop reacting and start choosing. You stop optimizing for survival and start thinking in timelines. That's why this number matters. Not because it's impressive, but because it's functional. You don't need to be rich to live differently. You don't need a breakthrough. You don't need permission. You just need enough room that life stops feeling like a constant emergency. Once you understand that money stops being about lifestyle, it becomes about leverage over your own behavior. And if that clicks for you, then the rest of this channel will make a lot more sense. Because everything else builds on the same idea. Create space first. Everything else only works after that.